Mustard Seed Generation began in 2007, and really it was my personal response to the Virginia Tech incident, the tragedy that occurred there. I think what it did for us is it gave us finally permission to unpack the stigma attached to mental health and wellness, and for us to begin to delve into really a reality that if you're an immigrant person, you probably were dealing with anyway. We need to talk about it. We need to name it, to name the realities of our immigrant children and parents and guardians who really have to maneuver into a new world and really function in a world, a host culture that is so different from their country of origin.
We're really about building bridges across cultural gaps, across generational gaps, especially in the Korean American community. And we really believe that the church is a really incredible place for Korean Americans. This is the place where many gather and find refuge.
Spirituality is the most important thing, but there's got to be a balance, not just with spirituality, but also with emotionally, even physically, intellectually, the wholeness of the person.
To see tears roll down, to see faces light up, and to see voices oohing and awing during the lectures and throughout the sermon, it shows that the stuff that we're covering is really addressing these needs.
culture gap이라는 것이 우리 아이들도 엄마를 통해서 느껴진다는 거, 제 생각만 한 게 아니라 아이들을 통해서 그 안에서 같이 대화의 해결책을 찾을 수 있을 거라는 희망이 가져서 너무 감사했어요. 내가 먼저 인정을 해주면 애도 그거에 대해서 느낄 것은 그런 생각이 들어요. 보기 보면 고치려고 이제 노력을 해야 되겠다.
I really believe this organization is here to reconcile people, create spaces where people could talk, create spaces where we can name things that people never knew there were names to. We really seek to build bridges in the community, bridges between children as well as youth leaders who are there to really support the families as well.
I think we've seen the importance of talking about that cultural divide, going from a second generation person to someone who just immigrated from that country. It can be so different and stressful, and there really isn't a manual to that we can just read up on and figure out how to do this. It's hard, and it can take a lot on a family.
Most of the youth who attempt suicide and end up in the emergency room, 76% of them said a big part of the reason that I tried to take my own life was because of these cultural conflicts with my parents. Mustard Seed Generation is about creating a language around these differences.
때로는 우리가 살아오면서 쌓인 얽힌 감정들 때문에 우리의 사랑을 표현할 수 없다는 거를 알게 됐거든요. 그래서 그런 어려움을 겪고 있는 사람들이 저희같이 전문적으로 훈련을 받은 사람들을 통해서 그 마음을 충분히 전달할 수 있도록 그런 일을 하기를 원했습니다.
Can we go out to help people become better listeners, to help people to communicate with their children better, to help children communicate with their parents better?
And it really truly is about the community. It's about doing what God has called us to do, recognizing that we're all broken people and that mental health is something that we're all impacted by, that none of us are above. And I think that's what's beautiful, that you see all these broken people coming together to meet with other broken people. And what only God can do through that brokenness is bring healing and reconciliation. And that truly is what's beautiful.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to MSG's 4th webinar, Navigating Race as Korean Americans. We are so excited to have you join us. We have an incredible lineup of speakers as well as a special performance at the end. So we hope that you could stay for the entirety of this webinar. I just want to say thank you so much. I have the privilege and honor of serving as the CEO of Mustard Seed Generation. My name is Kathy, and our organization is really passionate about creating these spaces that you've seen in that video, creating physical spaces where parents and kids can sit together and have a conversation about mental health and its importance. And now we're doing it virtually through this series. And we really hope to spark dialogue around mental health in our community. And we do this by bringing you virtually resources, and this webinar is one of them. This month of May, we've been doing a series to support Korean American families during this time of COVID, and we're very excited that you can join us. And so with that said, we want to first celebrate and say that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. It's also Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And lastly, in Korea, we celebrate it as Family Month, 가정의 달, where we celebrate not only parents and children, but also teachers. So if you identify with any or all of those titles, we want to celebrate you today. So thank you so much for joining us. Because this is a webinar, we wanted to create it and make it very interactive. So to go over a couple technical things so that you can really engage with our panelists throughout this conversation, we really want the audience to drive our conversation today. And so if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. We really encourage you to use that button throughout the webinar to ask any questions that you may have. You also have the option to ask it anonymously if that's important to you. Please go ahead and do that. And if you can make sure that questions are submitted not only to the panelists, but to the rest of the audience, that will actually allow the rest of our attendees to thumbs up any questions that they are also wanting to hear. And that will help our wonderful moderator prioritize which questions to ask our panelists. So we really ask for your engagement. Though it is virtual, we are going to try to make this as intimate and as fun as possible for all of us. So speaking of engagement, we're going to start that by beginning with 2 questions. We're going to start with a poll to get to know the audience a little bit better and where you're tuning in from. So you should see right now a poll on where you are tuning in from today. And as folks are voting right now, wow, this is really cool to see it live. I'm actually going to go around as people click on their locations and ask our panelists if you could start your cameras. And unmute yourselves. I'm going to actually ask some of our panelists here where they're tuning in from. So Jeanie, could you let us know where you are tuning in from today?
Yeah, I'm in Dallas, Texas.
That's so great. And how about you, Pastor Ray?
Hi, everybody. I'm in slightly north of Chicago, the city, in the north suburbs in Prospect Heights.
Nice. Excellent. Dr. Joe?
Hi, everyone. I'm tuning in from Boston. And still cold.
And Dr. Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm on the left coast here in sunny Southern California, Los Angeles. Best Korean food in the country.
West Coast.
It's true.
You could also type in the chat box as well if you want to shout out our amazing panelists here today. So let's look at the results. It looks like, wow, we have a majority from the Northeast. Very exciting. We also have someone outside of the US. Very exciting. I hope whoever that is, special appreciation for you. Please put in the chat box where you are tuning in from. I'm very curious. Thank you so much for participating. This looks great. We have someone from every corner, it seems like. So very excited for that. Our second question that we have for you is actually going to help our panelists better understand what kind of questions people are coming in with and what really motivated us all to join this webinar. And so I'm going to read it out loud just to give you all time to process and answer. But the question is, what brings you to this webinar today? The choices are to learn more about race dynamics in the US, to learn about how KAs, Korean Americans, fit into the race conversation, to hear from other KAs on the issue of race. Yes, we have a great panel here, so you will do that. To learn about the role of the church in race, to know more about anti-Asian sentiments and its historical context, to learn about the implications of racism on, I believe that should say, mental health. So that's to say, to learn about the implications of racism on mental health, to learn about how I can respond to incidents of bias, And lastly, to hear about how I can reconcile my faith with the issue of race. So it looks like people are voting along. We have 5 more seconds. Great, awesome. Could we see the poll results? Okay, we have some top ones to learn about how Ks fit into the race conversation, to hear from other Ks on the issue of race, yeah. So it looks like, I mean, we have questions about all of these topics, and hopefully we can really address that. So I'm actually gonna make sure I can pass it on to our wonderful moderators so we can get this conversation started. And so it is my privilege and honor to introduce our wonderful moderator, who is Dr. Josephine Kim. We fondly call her Dr. Jo, and she's currently a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In fact, all our staff members got to work with her and under her during our grad school years, and she actually founded Mustard Seed Generation, as you saw in the video, back in 2007, and since then has been spearheading this movement and allowing us to take part in it as well. She is also on our board of directors and is overseeing a lot of our activities and what we're doing through MSG. So without further ado, it is my privilege to pass it on to Dr. Josephine Kim.
Yay, thank you so much, Kathy, and shout out to Kathy. She's been doing so much work, and also want to welcome our panelists. I engage in conversations about race pretty much constantly, but I have to say it's very rare for me to sit with other Korean Americans to solely talk about race, and this is quite exciting for me. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and welcome our panelists. When I introduce you, if you want to go ahead and do like a woot woot or a hello or something, you're welcome to do that. We first have Ms. Jeanie Chang. She's a clinical mental health counselor from Wheaton College. There you go. We have Dr. Alexander Jun. He's professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific. Thank you. And he's joining.
I'm way too Korean, I'm sorry, but.
And we also have Ms. Kathy Khang, speaker and author of Raise Your Voice, Why Stay Silent, and How to Speak Up. Welcome. Thank you. And we also have Pastor Raymond Chang. He's the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative and campus minister at Wheaton College. Thank you for joining us. Okay, Kathy, if you can go ahead and, yep, there we go.
Hello.
Yes. So as I was saying, you know, I rarely engage in conversations of race solely with Korean Americans and really sit down for the purpose of solely talking about race and how we kind of fit into the paradigm. And I have to tell you, I've been losing sleep about today, just thinking about what are the things that we need to cover. I know so many people are excited to be here. And so if we could go ahead and just start with, what was it like from the moment you were asked to be on this panel? What are you kind of sitting with, feelings? Feelings are really of utmost interest to me right now. What are you sitting with as far as feelings? Jeanie, let's start with you. And I will call on people.
I think I am feeling a lot of different things, but one thing would be excitement, just because this is a topic that I've been passionate about and have had difficulty speaking with people like Korean American friends and family members about both race and mental health. And so to be able to talk about both of them together, I think is such a unique and really exciting thing for me.
Awesome, thank you. Who would you like to hear from?
Pastor Ray.
Yeah, it's great to be here with everyone, especially with many friends. I think for me, the sense I get is comfort, knowing that there are people that are kind of in the same kind of conversational world as us, that we're not just isolated in our own beings, which is part of the work that we're trying to do with the collaborative, and just excited to hear what everyone has to say.
Awesome. And who would you like to pass the baton to?
How about our voice raising Kathy Khang?
Woohoo!
I hail from the chilly north suburbs, further north than you, Pastor Ray. What I'm feeling, A little anxious. I think similar to you, Dr. Joe, I have not been in conversations around race in a Korean American context. And my experiences really honestly within the church to talk about race have not always been great. They've really been eye-opening in terms of not only the desire to assimilate into whiteness and into kind of American culture, but also the anti-Blackness that goes undiscussed in places, right? So I'm just gonna be honest in that space in saying I'm a little, I mean, I'm excited, but also a little anxious. This is definitely a new conversation and an important one.
Thank you. And the person joining us from Joseon, Korea.
Yes, it's so what an honor to be part of this conversation. I was really looking forward to it. I think similar to what Kathy was saying, a lot of these conversations when we talk about race is always sort of rooted in white supremacy and dominance, anti-Blackness. And when we talk about race or people of color, we use that almost simultaneously, many of us, with Black and brown. Resistance, I'm used to, speaking primarily with white brothers and sisters in the church, lots of resistance and denial and justification, and not terribly surprising, Korean Americans in the church, increasingly resistant, quiet for the most part, assimilating quietly and finding economic success or educational success, and buying into the model minority stereotype, saying it's not an issue. It's just not an issue. Many are in communities all around us, and we break bread together with them all the time and rarely ever talk about this. So I was really looking forward to having this conversation on a broader national scale, as opposed to so much of it is localized in my own community, even in my own church. The pushback always is, Alex, why are you talking about this? Yeah. Almost to a point where somebody once said to me, and completely unaware of what he was saying, he said, if you keep talking about stuff like whiteness, they're not gonna like us. I mean, that captures, in one sense, the collectivistic nature of realizing that if I'm talking about it, it implicates all of us. And then what's rooted in that is this desire for assimilation and to please, to say, please don't talk about these types of things because it's just, it makes us all uncomfortable. And what you do, and it reflects negatively on me. So maybe I put too much into the words, but that's sort of where I realized we need to talk about this. So I'm so glad we're doing this. Thank you, Joe.
Sure, thank you. And I think it's so important to name those feelings because it helps us to recognize, I mean, talking about race is not easy. And it's certainly not easy, I think, talking about it in our communities. And I'm really approaching this conversation as if we're sitting in a cafe, just chatting. And so I hope we can stay organic and just very real about the conversation. But oftentimes it's so uncomfortable because when we look back into our childhoods or in our past, there's usually a really uncomfortable experience that we can reflect back to where it kind of opened our eyes to race, perhaps. And I'm wondering what that experience may have been for you. And maybe Pastor Ray, we can start with you.
Wait, can you ask the question one more time? I was laughing at a chat comment. Sorry about that.
What is that one experience, perhaps, looking back when your eyes were open to the issue of race?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, right? Because I think I had multiple phases in which, like, my eyes were opened up to it. Because I didn't have language until probably like my mid-20s, I just felt like I was the problem, right? I thought that I was the issue, that something was wrong with me all the time. That, you know, I was supposed to be okay with people making jokes about my eyes or my skin color or, you know, the smell of my food, and I had to, you know, essentially accept other weird smells that were not normal to me and normative to me, even though I was born in the United States and consider myself fully American. I just knew that I was constantly othered, but I think that there were moments, even like, you know, like when I was a kid, you know, 3rd grade, 4th grade, people would call me chink, or they would call me gook, or they would call me nip. And I had nobody to really understand what was going on. There were probably 5 other Asians within our community. And though we liked to hang out with each other, we never wanted to be seen with each other. But these are things that I could never articulate when I was younger. I just felt it. And it was only when I started studying, scholarship that addressed issues of justice and addressed issues of race towards my mid-20s that I started understanding, oh, this is actually a very common thing, that we're not alone in all this. We're not crazy when we feel like we're being excluded or we're being kind of overlooked or kind of pushed down. And that's, so I think I felt it a long time ago, but I wasn't able to articulate it until kind of my mid-20s. And I think that had done a lot of damage in my own kind of mental health, my own kind of sense of being, my sense of identity, my sense of self. And I wish that I had people that were having these types of conversations in the church, in my family, around me, so that I could have made sense of what was going on around me.
Sure. Yeah, so much about where do we locate the problem, right? And if you don't know the larger context, the problem ends up with you. Thank you. I think you've probably validated a lot of people in this webinar right now. So thank you. What about others?
Well, I know I grew up through 2nd grade on the north side of Chicago, and the issue of race for me did not come up until I moved into the suburbs, right? And because the north side, the location we were at the time was very much an immigrant community, and I knew that Vikram was Indian and Serge was Filipino, and that was totally normal and understandable, right? Grandparents, different smells in different homes, that was normal. And then we moved into the West Burbs, and that was the first time I interacted with whiteness in that sense. And I will never forget, when you're new to a school, back then you were assigned a buddy to show you around the school. And so my buddy was Gwen, and Gwen was showing me around. Here's the bathroom, here's the water fountain, here's where you go and have lunch. And she stopped at one point and she looked at me and she said, well, what is wrong with your nose and your eyes? And I stopped because I had never had anything like that happen to me. And I said, well, what's wrong with your face and your eyes and your nose? And we actually became great friends and have reconnected in adulthood and talk about that. And that your first experience around racialization has to happen, right? When you are kind of outside your community. And I think for me, that initial experience was not traumatic. It was more of a like, oh, there's this whole other world I had not experienced. But then growing up in that particular school district, we were the first family of color in the school district. And I realized I had never really talked to my children about it until recently, now that we're all cooped up together in the house. And they were saying, yeah, we got teased, but I don't really know anyone who got bullied. And I said, oh, I did. And it was physical. It was, the onset of what I would now know as anxiety and triggering depression, right? So I think that much like Pastor Ray, my parents were busy working, but they also didn't have language for what they were experiencing, right? Because they were complete outsiders, they're immigrants. But I think of that particular shift in that kind of very innocent, childlike Gwen noticing something very different, and me trying not to put an intention or judgment on that difference, just kind of like, oh, well, what's wrong with your face? You look kind of weird and different to me too. And then what followed, which was just years of not just teasing, it was bullying and physical intimidation. Yeah.
That's good. I can pick up on that. talking about bullying and fear, growing up, living in this combination of fear and longing, and being bullied by Black and white kids, elementary and junior high school and high school. And this is always interesting, Joe, you're a psychologist, and so to talk about this publicly, let's have counseling all together where everybody's watching Alex talk about his feelings. Yeah, lots of very, very conflicted emotions of fear and longing, fearing and despising the white kids, but longing to be like them in the popularity. And the teasing also came from Black and brown classmates, but culture was cool. And so it's one of those things of young Alex just longing to be and find his identity. It was any identity, act white, act Black, but definitely don't act Asian. This ties into what the media portrayed Asians to be. I'm old enough to know Hop Sing and Long Duck Dong and growing up with those images. And so those are terrifying for me. And you try to shed your own identity as much as possible. Culture, heritage, language, mannerisms, all of that. So you're always vacillating between, do I act white, do I act Black, or whatever those terms mean, but you can't be yourself. And so that's just an ongoing, I think I'm still trying to work through that. I've got 3 teenage children. And again, just like you, Kathy, they grew up in a very different context. And when I share with them these things happen to me, they, their first response is, no wonder you are the way you are. That's why you do what you do. May be true.
Yeah, I think I can really resonate with the combination of fear and longing. I think growing up in the suburbs of Texas in predominantly white neighborhoods, I had repressed a lot of the events that have happened to me, and had perceived them more as, oh, other kids were just being immature, or I am just socially awkward. I remember one time my family was eating dinner and neighborhood kids snuck into our backyard and watched us eat dinner, and then the next day made fun of us for eating poop. And even like something as shocking as that, I had just said, oh, well, they're just immature kids. Like, what am I going to do about it? And it wasn't until I was in therapy and talking about this to my therapist that I realized, oh, actually, maybe a root of a lot of my social anxiety, the fear of like not belonging, stems from these experiences that I've had repressed and misunderstood, and thought and had attributed to myself, and things that I had done wrong or something lacking with me, instead of because I didn't have the language to understand those contexts and the systems.
Thank you. I'm noticing our chat box, and John Shin, just now talked about Asians need to be liberated, the fear and insecurity, how it really cripples us from taking risks and really fulfilling, I guess, our lives. And I'm just wondering, what are the psychological impacts that it's had on your own lives? I know for me, Alexander, when you were talking about racial identity development, in essence, I was in stage 1 for a long time, where I wanted to be white, walk white, talk white, look white as whatever that meant, even dream in English and, doing all those things. And so I think what it does to us, for one, is that we begin to internalize these messages, that something, as Pastor Ray said, something is wrong with you. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the psychological impacts. Jeanie, I know you started to do that, but what psychological impacts did all of those experiences have?
Yeah, just to continue off of what I was talking about with internalizing negative beliefs, I think it's a way that we are protecting ourselves, because it gives us a sense of control in a system where we have no control, where things are not within our locus of responsibility. And so rather than believe that I'm unsafe or that people don't like me because of things that I can't control, it's safer to believe that I'm just overreacting or I am misunderstanding other people. they're probably have their own issues too, so I should be more understanding. And I think especially as Christians, this can be really crippling. When I moved to Wheaton, I experienced a lot of microaggressions and felt a lot of pain, a lot of anger. And my first reaction was a lot of shame, because I felt like I wasn't being a good Christian for not being able to love my neighbors, for not being able to be empathetic. And it took a lot of therapy and people validating my experience, validating my emotions, and telling me that we can't just skip to forgiveness and reconciliation and unity. First, there's the acknowledgement and bearing witness to the pain and to the experience and the emotions that you have.
Thank you. Kathy, what about you? All of the, as you talked about, I think people sometimes doubt that Asians face racism because we've been so off-white, or we've been made to feel very off-white, not quite white, but, definitely having more privileges than other people groups. How has that been for you, and what psychological toll or impact has that had?
Well, I think there's the both and. I think there's the impact that is within the broader culture and society, right? So I call it, we self-gaslight. We gaslight ourselves. We tell ourselves that actually was not racist. Like Jeannie, you had said, like, oh, that they're just kids. Well, okay, yes, I know that now, but having parented kids, they also mimic what they learn at home.
That's right.
And in the communities that they live in, right? And so so there's that understanding. And I think also what's been interesting too, now that I'm an adult child, right, in conversations with my parents, there's also the space within the Korean community, right, within our own families or churches, for those of us who grew up in the Korean American church, the immigrant church, to downplay that as well, right? And it is both they won't like us if you make a lot of noise. We don't want to be complainers because look what happens when the Black community complains. And also, there's survival, right? I have to tell myself all the time, my parents did the best they could. They did the best they could. And I can't even imagine the trauma that they have carried, that they bring, and that they lived with intention when then they brought their parents or their siblings to the US and didn't have the time or the resources to unpack that in healthy ways, and then to lose that ability to communicate with the younger generation. And so for me, where I sit right now is this place of, again, fear and longing, but less fear, a lot of longing, because I can no longer speak my mother tongue with the fluency that I once had. And in allowing that to happen, feel like, how will I get that full healing that I want with my family, with my community, because of the language barrier, not just cultural barrier, but the language barrier, I think is where I'm wrestling with. And there are no easy answers, right? I mean, my parents have learned as much English as they possibly can. I feel like the onus is now on me.
Kathy, I love how you frame that. And the word that comes to mind for me is you're grieving, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Grieving the loss of heritage and language.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Grew up in, say, Korea, or grew up speaking Korean. A lot of parents may have, or grandparents forced you to, say you have to speak Korean because you are Korean.
Right.
And you knew at an early age, for me, I knew that was a detriment. That was never seen as a positive. Bilingual fluency and biculturalism, it was never a positive, at least not Korean, because what was offered in school was French.
Right.
I mean, well, why French? And so it was French or German or maybe Spanish. And so why those were the options? I think it was this I'm going to divorce myself from anything that is negative, and that's going to hinder me from, at an early age, it would be just social acceptance.
Right.
And then you realize as you get older and you know, the language issue and culture, you realize, boy, I sure miss those opportunities where I could have spoken more Korean and been embracing of my heritage and culture. And then, you know, it kind of comes back. I think the other part of this, to your question, is not just a psychological, but it's a spiritual, deeply spiritual anger for me at my parents, displaced, right? To say, why did you come to the United States? It wasn't just me who was suffering in school and being teased relentlessly. It was my parents who suffered. Part of it, ignorance is bliss, that they didn't fully understand some of the things that were being said to them. I certainly did, but too young to really act on it. And then you realize God made you this way. And so I've said this in other talks, where then how do you reconcile that? Was God some cosmic killjoy who found joy and entertainment in watching young Alex suffer? Or is there anything that I can do to change who I am? And physically, no. I mean, you know, plastic surgery and whatever else, and lighten your hair and different, you know, there's things that you could do, but fundamentally, there's nothing that I could change. And how do you reconcile that with God? That you are made in God's image, Imago Dei. That's hard to reconcile as a young person. That's hard to reconcile now.
Yeah, I mean, the confluence of what everyone is sharing, I think what it, at least in my own life, and as I kind of counsel students and talk to different, whether they're Asian American or people of color broadly, because a part of what we're dealing with is racialization, and the way that racialization has impacted all communities of color by creating hierarchies that essentially diminish, chip away all that God has kind of deposited into us and allowed us to bring to the table. I think that there's, for me, it led to a lot of emotional stunting, to the point that I had to learn how to dissociate in order to just survive. And I never learned how to process that until kind of more recently. And because of that, like, I didn't know how to like navigate the feelings, because no one first gave me language to navigate feelings, and then two, helped me on that journey, because every feeling became too scary, right? And as a Korean man, to say the word scary at the beginning made me feel extremely weak. It felt like, oh my gosh, I'm a failure as a Korean male. But what I realized was that there were all these stereotypes placed on me, and then there were also cultural things that we brought, that were brought forward in order to survive, the model minority trope, that basically made me say, my emotions are not important. What I'm actually experiencing is not important. And the only thing that's important is success. And I don't think that was intentional, but it was the way that they learned how to survive in this racialized society. And as a result, that's what they had to kind of pass on to us, so that we wouldn't experience the same level of discrimination, the same level of pain that they had. And so I think there's an element of the emotional stunting that has taken place, mostly through dissociation. And you know you're dissociated when you just kind of like go dark, right? When you don't know what you're feeling, when you just kind of become numb. And I think that's a lot. I mean, when I talk to my especially my Asian American students, they'll say that all the time, like, I don't know how to navigate my feelings. And I'm like, yeah, because you've never been given language for navigating your feelings, or a toolkit for your feelings. But then I also think that it leads us to become more socially disengaged, right? Because we don't know how to navigate ourselves. And by socially, it doesn't mean that we don't know how to have like friendships, but our friendships may not always go as deep as they could go. But also that we don't know how to kind of apply ourselves into kind of the societal injustices, because again, we're scrambling, treading water, just trying to navigate our own lives, because we have so many things that we haven't dealt with ourselves.
Yes, thank you. And, you know, I think, again, it leads to this deep internalized hatred self-hatred for our culture, for ourselves, again, because we don't understand necessarily the larger context. We're very different from African Americans who actually sit down with their children, even at ages 3 and 4 and 5, and they talk about experiences of discrimination, what it looks like, what it could feel like, and actually what you do when that happens. And I feel like African American children are much more prepared, and they also understand, I would say, more of the nuance related to race and race relations. We're getting some really rich questions that are related to this, self-hatred, for example. I think it's so important for us to state that society has a role for every race group to play, right? And for Asians and Asian Americans, that role is to be quiet, don't rock the boat, be the achievers, right? Help us prove that there's no discrimination in this nation because you are so successful. And so when we have this narrative and this reality, how does all of this impact our interracial relationships? And especially going back to Daniel Lee and his comment about what do we do when the church is not necessarily a great place to have these conversations, and why is that? Again, going back to especially the anti-Black sentiments that we often see in our communities. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. However, whatever direction you want to take that, it's up to you.
Well, I think part of the challenge is that as Korean Americans, right, I don't know for the other panelists or even for participants, I grew up with a very distinct, like, be proud you are Korean. And my parents, even though I came at 8 months old, I was fluent in Korean. It was the only language I spoke when I started school. And so there was this very strong sense of identity at home, right? And then it's split. You can't carry that outside of the home. And then you bring it into church. And that's where it got really messy, because then it was, well, how Korean are you? And how well could you speak Korean? Not only how well could you speak Korean, but then how good were your grades, right? So, and then how that plays into the more interracial, broader, multi-ethnic, multiracial existence is, one, I wrestled with what it meant to identify broadly as Asian American. What does that even mean? Because that is a political, socio-political term. That is not, my parents do not identify as Asian American. They are Korean. And they don't understand this thing that we do, the young people. And I think because of that, and then in our schools growing up, we don't learn a lot about the history of Asians immigrating, coming, finding asylum, refugees, being adopted. We don't learn that history. And so we don't understand the connections with what happens in colonialism and how war happened in Asia, and how anti-Blackness, there is a kind of anti-Blackness that was exported to our motherlands because of military presence, right? And all that goes on there, and then is then brought back when folks come to the US. And there are language barriers, right? So if we're specifically talking about African American, the anti-Blackness, there are lots of cultural issues that also have to be broken down. And that model a minority myth, I think, is so challenging, because many of our parents, the only reason why they were allowed in the US was because of their education, because of their skills, right? Even though they could not get a job straight off the bat in that area, or maybe never could, I think we have to acknowledge that that's why, as Asian Americans, East Asians particularly, we are set up for this very thing. We were set up to be the wedge. So how do we educate ourselves? And then how do we see the connections with the African Black civil rights movement and what is being termed as for civil rights for Asians, which is around immigration policy, right? How do we find the intersections? And then how do we find the stories of our families to kind of break that down and then find conversation partners in the Black community for this.
I've heard and said this myself, that Korean Americans are often seen as the white people of Asian American communities, that we're so full of ourselves and privilege and all of these types of things. It's a challenge, I think, when we talk about Korean pride and things that maybe, and this is where it gets really good for Korean Americans to talk amongst ourselves, implicit and explicit messages we've heard growing up in our homes, with our aunts and uncles, in the church, about how we view other Asians. What you've heard about Chinese and Chinese Americans, Japanese, and the long history there with Korea. And depending on your context, if your parents were working in certain fields, in certain businesses, most of their interaction and suffering was at the hands of Black and brown customers. I'm in Los Angeles, and we're 28 years in with the LA riots, and still unresolved. Still unresolved. It's going to happen again because we never really address the issue. And so, if you talk about anti-Blackness, I think that's part of what's rooted in with xenophobia and nationalism. Korean American parents still talk about Korea and South Korea and all these issues. So there's still a lot of patriotism and nationalism. But the anti-Blackness is the issue, and I'm trying to understand and get to sort of an empathetic understanding of the generation, and by extension their children, whose parents suffered at the hands of Black and brown citizens, their neighbors. The complexities. Do you call it a liquor store or do you call it a grocery store? Depending on your perspective, right? This was at the heart of what was going on in LA and other places as well, where the Black community would say, you're coming in and selling poison to our community, and you don't live in the community, you're benefiting. It wasn't that they weren't working hard, right? That's the other challenge of this. So trying to understand and embrace both realities. But at its root, I think, is this anti-Blackness that I really want to address with Korean and Korean Americans. In our own communities, we still haven't talked about, we still talk about our suffering. And certainly there was suffering at the hands of, in this example, with perhaps African American friends. But what was rooted is this anti-Blackness. Words that I won't repeat, but the N-word in Korean, the equivalent of the N-word in Korean, regularly spoken. Because maybe there is no other appropriate word that our community has developed in Korean. Using the N-word in English among Korean Americans and Asian American communities is not a form of solidarity. And we need to address that. But those are window dressings that I feel like we could probably fix. And I don't want to go down this path of just controlling politically correct language. We certainly need to address that, but it's a deeper underlying issue of anti-Blackness that we have bought into ourselves. It's tied into the model minority trope that we believe in.
Sure. And there's colorism, though, in our own community as well,
Yeah,
right? Within the Korean, right? The Korean community. And the like, I didn't understand that until I was in my teens, going out to the pool, right? And my parents saying like, oh no, don't go out in the sun. Or my first, my summer in Korea when I was in college, and my kunoma like gave me a parasol, and I was like, what is this? You don't want to get dark because that's not pretty. And so there's also that part of the anti-Blackness that is separate from the American experience, right? So I think that's also the challenging part, is that America is not the center of the world. And so American history isn't essential to be taught to our parents when they were students. So they don't have that understanding of what was happening here in America. And then to bring whatever experiences they had or interactions with the military, and they come here and they're building family and home wherever they can, doing whatever they can, and then also having the colorism from our own communities, I think is all those other things that are coming into play.
Yeah, and I think that part of what Kathy's addressing and is the importance of our need to understand history, our own history. I mean, I never learned Asian American history until I studied it myself, way maybe even like just 5-10 years ago. So it hasn't been that long since I've been exposed to Asian American history. So I remember hearing that Japanese were interned, but that might have been like 20 minutes of a lecture in one of my elementary school, junior high school, or college years, and I can't even remember which one because it was such a blur. And so there, like this month, a PBS documentary called Asian Americans came out. Several of our friends are in it, and so it's worth watching and exploring. It was fun to kind of to text with them and to chat with them and to hear kind of what they were thinking when they were being interviewed. But then, with the Asian American Christian Collaborative, if you go onto our website, we actually just launched a series. We're in the second of three parts where we're talking about this very issue. We're talking about the history, how to between Asian Americans and African Americans. We're talking about how to address the racial biases and then how to move forward together. Because if you look at even if you just start with the history, we were set up to be pit against each other. We were set up never to really be in solidarity with one another. Asians were brought in as replacement labor for African Americans when it no longer became economically lucrative, which is why addressing issues of economics is so important when we're talking about issues of race. And the fact that we're just, the whole notion that we're just trying to find a better life for ourselves means that we're participating in a system and being complicit in a system that could ultimately disadvantage other people based on, one of the categories is racial factors. And there's a bunch of scholarship that you can look into around that. And so, me and a bunch of other Asian, like Jeff Leo, Michelle Reyes, Tasha Morrison from Be the Bridge, we've gotten together with other community members from the African American, Asian American communities to talk about working through the tensions that exist. But we can't just assume that our tensions today are individual. We inherited all of them. Right? And so we inherited them within a system where whites are right, and that there's a white racial superiority or white supremacy that's kind of advanced through a form of white dominance and white normativity. And until we reckon with that, I don't think that we'll have a full enough understanding of the things that we need to address. But those are things that I think we definitely need to do. And one of the things I say on a practical level is when Asian Americans go from one city to another, they go for another job or they go for a school, they oftentimes have this conversation internally. Do I want to break out of the immigrant first generation church and go to another church? And the options are usually another Asian American church or a white church. Why is it never a black church or a brown church? Right? Why not go into a church where you're being pastored by an African American or being pastored by a Latino? And those are things that are ingrained within us because we still believe that whiteness is superior to all the others.
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone said, and especially the learning about the histories. I think I couldn't fully understand my Asian American history until I understood Black and Brown and Indigenous histories. Our histories are so tied together, and so we're doing a disservice to ourselves by not engaging in those narratives and believing and understanding those narratives.
Yes, thank you. And going specifically more towards the Korean family, immigrant family, some things that we never talk about are the loss and grief from the immigration process, especially our parent generations. I mean, when they immigrated, there were no FaceTime, Kakao, or anything like that. And so I remember in college having to write letters to my parents and waiting months to get a reply back, and calling them was such a privilege. And so that grief and loss is something that gets transmitted intergenerationally and something we don't talk about. We also don't often talk about the domination and the colonization of Japan and Korea. That was for 33 years, where Koreans were erased. And from that, I think we've developed such defense mechanisms. You're not one of us. I don't like you, period. I'm not going to talk to you. And it's also created a deep inferiority complex. Looking at it psychologically, where we, instead of wanting, if there's a chance I'm going to be a little bit inferior, I'm just going to nip that at the bud and be better than you. And I think that's also deeply ingrained. And so it leads to a question by Ken Kim. What are strategies for engaging the first generation Koreans about race, racism, and racial bias? We're all smiling because we're like, oh my gosh. And maybe I could even start this off. For me, one thing that's really worked with my parents is to talk about the Korean history. Imagine you remember the impacts, right, that we're still now suffering from those 33 years of being colonized. Imagine if that was the case for 400 plus years. Right. And then it's like, whoa, I can't imagine that. And I found that was a nice way to kind of get into something that they were very familiar with, to talk about something they're not so familiar with. But what about others? What are some strategies? And we're all still smiling.
I mean, this is a hard one, right? Because I think I would assume, my assumption is, if we're even talking about these issues, we've probably had these conversations with our families. And it's interesting how much, propaganda is actually spread through apps like Cow Talk. The things that are, I mean, like the things that some of my family members send, I'm just like, what is this? But my wife, she's Korean American as well. At one point, I would call her like a 1.8 generation. And one of the conversations she had, this was actually helpful for me, because one of the conversations she had when she was in college was bringing up the idea of what it would be like for her to bring home a Black man to be her husband. And that was a conversation that led to her parents saying, at first, being very reticent and resistant, right? Because all the things that they had heard from within their own community were things that that they had adopted and just kind of accepted as the truth. But then over time, that conversation led to her mom, especially going, "Yeah, I don't know where that came from," and that was wrong. That was sinful. And if you ended up marrying a Black guy, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't see why. I mean, like, there would be some hard things like language barrier and food, especially if they can't, they don't share the same palate. But even me hearing that and just hearing the process of how that went, right? Because obviously we weren't together at the time, but hearing that was very encouraging for me, because like with my parents, they just don't want to talk about it, or they'll say, oh yeah, racism exists, and we're not the ones that perpetuate it. It's these others. And so they follow kind of the white logic of, oh, only the KKK are white supremacists. It's not anyone that upholds, white dominant society. They have to be cross-burning, full-fledged members of the Nazi Party in order to be, to be a true racist. And breaking that down and dismantling that one thing at a time has been extremely challenging. And they're generally very open, right? So they're much more open, but it just doesn't register because most of their life has been, again, trying to survive, trying to navigate. I think finding personal ways, which is not always the most efficient, sometimes can be the most effective.
I found that rather than addressing whenever they would say anti-Black things, rather than talking about that specifically, giving them more context and information to help them like see things from a different perspective is sometimes helpful. I think it depends. So like my mom is kind of more like, I already have enough like knowledge. I don't need to know anymore. But my dad was a little bit more open. So with the recent shootings and things like that, I really wanted him to understand a little more. So I watched 13th, the documentary, with him on Netflix, and I just sat next to him and I asked him every 5 minutes, did you understand what they said? And tried to explain things, translate things. And he was really shocked. He had no idea about anything about mass incarceration and things like that. And I think it really opened his eyes to, okay, so Black people aren't just criminals. Like, there's a reason why this narrative has been formed. And so giving them historical facts that seem less like opinion-based and less emotionally charged, I think that was helpful for me.
I think a big part has to be the way we have to shift our gaze, our fundamental assumptions. If I apply this to the church, if you think any kind of work you're going to do for a Black community, why do you assume that it's charity? It's never a posture or disposition of learning. It's always charitable. Not even justice, it's just charity. And I think that works from this assumption that is a steady diet of education or miseducation that we've all bought into about anti-Blackness and, you know, the culture of poverty and all these types of things. So it's growing in our empathy, if you will. That's one challenge. The other challenge is, if you're an immigrant suffering along, the danger of oppression Olympics, right? To say, well, I've suffered more. I've been shot at. I've heard that as the justification from a lot of people. For my parents were shot at and robbed, so why are you saying this? Part of that could be just, you know, our economic desires. We may need to challenge the very capitalist notion of what we're trying to do. Why are you trying to make money in communities where all you're doing is selling, as some would say, poison to the communities? What have you done with the community? So, I mean, that's, you know, calling on someone's empathetic Christian side to say, this is work that we need to do in solidarity. The other way of framing it, depending on the generation, is let's look at what it's like when you're in the dominant group. Let's look at South Korea, for example, and some of the racist policies that are anti-Black and anti-foreigner that are still in place today in Korea. And you're the dominant group. So let's try to understand from that perspective how this is wrong, that prejudice multiplied by power is racism. And you can see that in places like South Korea and in other countries as well. But since we're talking about older generation Koreans, how do you reconcile that? And now you can apply that to the United States and see. And so I think just shifting the perspective, thinking fast versus thinking slow is also very important. Your gut reaction to something, which is, you know, over time just reinforced by negative experiences. So when you see certain types of people, you get nervous. When you see other types of people, you feel comforted. How do you change that? Neuroscientists have been trying to work on that as well, to change the way we naturally respond with fear and anxiety when you see a Black person.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? Kathy, I know you've already spoken. Yeah, thanks for that. So we have another question. What can we do to address or reconcile with our aggressors? There's that website where it was collecting COVID-19 incidents of racism from Asian Americans and finding, I think within the first 4 weeks, they had gotten 1,500 complaints or reports already. So how do we reconcile with our aggressors? One of the things that's challenging for us as I'm hearing you speak is that we have to be able to sit with two seemingly contradicting realities, but be okay with holding both of those, right? Yes, those things should not have happened to you. Maybe, you know, those things, whether it's racist incidents or whatnot, should not have happened to you. And also being able to place that person in a larger systemic society. So again, how do we reconcile with our aggressors?
When I think of reconciliation, I see it more as a two-way street. Not only do you move towards them, but the other person has to also move towards you. And so if we're speaking of aggressors, as in like the example of COVID-related racism, and it's some random person on the street, they're not likely to move towards you. In fact, you're likely to get hurt. And so I would say your first priority should be safety. So de-escalating situation, getting out of there, because that person's not going to listen to you. Why would they, right? And so I think maybe in those situations, safety is first, and reconciliation can be something that can be sought in communities that you are a part of, where you have relationships with people and they know that you care about them, so you're able to have these harder discussions. And I would say with aggression, to think of, it's okay to think about yourself. It's not selfish to think about the pain that you've experienced and to feel anger, to feel hurt. And that's not unchristian of you to sit in that for a bit and let Jesus heal that before moving to empathy, before moving to trying to reconcile with someone.
I will probably get into the most trouble by saying this, and I want to try to put it in context, but still. If you're in a situation where you're still being aggressed upon, if you're still suffering and victimized, then forgiveness is not the right time. So I want to be very careful as I say that. Speaking more systemically or collectivistically, such a movement in the church, different, my own denomination, the PCA and others, where they've had public confessions for the wrongdoing, right? That's good. Other institutions are starting to acknowledge that and recognize it, offer apologies. There's a lot of pushback for people who say, well, I wasn't here when it happened, so why would I have a collective apology to be made? They don't understand so the covenantal nature and the connectional nature of God's people. But what we haven't seen is a collective forgiveness. We haven't had a statement yet. Always public apologies and acknowledgements and confessions, but never a public forgiveness. What does that look like? I've never seen it. We've never moved to that to say, and who has the right to say it? But I think on an individual level, my ability to forgive my friends and colleagues for saying racist things, for example, or having done things, I have the ability to forgive, or I have the ability to harbor it and resent and hold on. I don't think that's healthy. For me, I think counseling and therapy is important, getting to a point where I'm able to forgive. But public statements I have not seen yet, where a group of people, Korea and Japan is always an example for me. I think South Korea is longing for recognition and an apology, formal apology for comfort women and all the abuses from Japan. And they, a few years ago, there was an acknowledgement and a form of apology, and South Koreans, by and large, said that's not enough. And so my response was, where's the forgiveness from South Korea? Where are we going to say, we acknowledge that you've acknowledged this and we collectively will forgive? I don't know. That's not something we talk about because it's so far out of the realm of possibility for us, perhaps, that we're only looking for people to confess wrongdoing. But I don't think that's how reconciliation works. It has to be a two-way street. We have to then acknowledge what people are saying and we have to bring it in. I don't know, but it's something that I want to put on the table to say we should consider that.
I just want to add to that with forgiveness, there are counseling interventions based on forgiveness. And so it's super important, super freeing. But the first step for all of those interventions is acknowledging the pain and sitting in the pain. And I think that's why forgiveness is sometimes better understood as a process rather than a one-time decision, because sometimes you don't really understand the full extent of how you were impacted by an event. And maybe it's later in life that you realize, wow, this actually hurt me a lot more than I realized in the moment, and you have to forgive again, right? And so I think that's the difficult thing with forgiveness is it's not, you have to fully face the pain that was unjustly inflicted on you before you can move to forgiving, empathy, things like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
And I do think around I'm losing my train of thought. That there is an element that what was I going to say? There was a noise that I'm kind of like that dogging up that distracted me.
I had a moment of that myself.
No, but I do think that forgiveness is important. I mean, we are a people of of grace, and so if we're Christian, we have to find ways to extend grace. I think one of the challenges, around issues of race, racialization, racism, is that it's not so much like a one-time experience, but it's like being in an abusive relationship, right? So how many times do you continue to forgive and stay in the relationship? And so I'm a proponent of forgiveness. I'm thankful that Jesus forgave me of my sins, and it's because of that I can do any form of forgiving. But like one of the things I notice is that there's a lot of people that confess their sin but aren't actually repentant of their sins, right? And so they'll make these statements, and then 5, 10, 20 years later, they'll just revert back to the same old habits, the same old thinking, the same old behaviors. And an element of that is consistent with the depravity of sin that comes with the depravity of sin. But another element is like when it's systemic, it means that people are actively and holding it up through a variety of methods and ways that continues to hurt the people that are most marginalized. In terms of reconciliation, I think you look through the scripture, and reconciliation is never just called upon without first establishing justice, right? And so if we really want reconciliation, we need to get to a place of justice first. And especially within like those who are like the more evangelical types, we love the word unity. You can't get to unity without justice, right? I mean, there was no unity between us and God until Jesus paid the just cost for us to be reconciled to him. And so I do think that there's an element that we have to think about in terms of like how deep not only the confession is, but the repentance that follows. And if the repentance isn't there, it's faith without works, right? It's this shallow lip service that I'm confessing something, but it's not actually happening. You ask my wife, like if I'm truly sorry, she'll say, I'll know you're truly sorry by the behavior change that comes along with it, not by just you saying that you're sorry. And that's a lot of these statements that have come out, I think, throughout history. I think in terms of reconciliation also, we could take a page out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that you can't have reconciliation without truth. And a lot of times people want reconciliation without confronting the truth. And that's why the prophetic ministry or people who have a more prophetic voice are oftentimes marginalized. You see throughout scripture that people who are known as prophets are killed. And that's because people have a natural sinful disposition in opposition to the truth. And because we are Christian, especially if we are Christian, we are supposed to press into the truth, as difficult and as painful and as hard as it is, which is why I think as part of the work that we have to do also is the emotional work, so that we're not dissociating, where feelings aren't that scary, where confronting the truth isn't as scary and terrifying.
I keep losing my words because I am sitting here as an attendee soaking everything up. So thank you so much. I was going to say, I don't know if true reconciliation could happen without us having friends who are Black and brown and of all sorts of classes, and we invite them into our homes, go to church with them, go to different social events, and have these very real conversations. And so I really encourage all of us, to really take stock of our friendships. Like, who do we actually invite into our homes? Do they all look like us? Do they all speak like us? Do they all, think like us? And if that's the case, then I would say that's a barrier probably to reconciliation. I'm looking at our time and I'm just so sad. I feel like we could do this for another 10 hours. But I do feel like Samuel Beck has been waiting for a long time, and it's such a great question, I think, to end with. My question might be a little more basic. That's okay, Samuel. We appreciate that after all these really tough, challenging questions. What does it mean to have a healthy view and understanding of yourself as a Korean American? I really like this one. What aspects of being Korean American are you grateful for and proud of? And maybe we can end with that. Kathy, go ahead. I see you brewing.
Well, Like I said, I grew up with a deep appreciation for being Korean and learning language and forgetting it, and understanding that it is not a perfect culture, right? So there are things, I mean, we could have a whole nother session on patriarchy and sexism within our communities and our churches, right? So, and so in that, I think the things that I really have been grateful for are the stories of resilience, and how in the horrors that my family experienced, that they have continued to point to God, right? As somebody who grew up in the church and loves Jesus, that I could always count on until the day my grandmother passed. She was praying for her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. And to this day, there is, you know, I'm sure they were praying for the success of their children, but my parents continue that tradition. And understanding some of the cultural traditions that were brought here, and the importance of that, and how that has affirmed my Christian values, right? The things that I'm sure looked strange to my white or non-Korean friends, like sebe, right? And bowing to our elders. We did not stay up late at New Year's Eve parties. We went to church for New Year's Eve, and then we would rush off and make sure that we were bowing. And I think those are the types of things that really connect and resonate, that I still and have passed on to my children, who are now young adults as well. That this isn't found in American white culture. This is distinctly Korean culture that affirms and reflects God's goodness for us.
Yeah, I just want to echo the part about praying. Learning how to pray in a Korean immigrant church is so unique. Growing up, going to 새벽 예배 and all the pastors in the front kneeling and screaming 주여, I think it became kind of like the basis of how I practice lament. And it showed me what it was like to cry out to God and seek his presence desperately. So that passion and that fire that Korean churches have, I think that has really formed me as a Korean Christian.
Two things. One is the fearlessness that seems to be part of a people. Such a tiny little country. It's so full of itself. I'm like, you have to have some real pride to be that bold for such a small country, to be able to take over the world and have the sense that you could do these types of things. And then that same mentality is brought over to the United States in the immigrant experience. Fearless, that we're going to find a way to make it. Incredible. The other interesting point for me would be food. That's sort of tied into culture and family. I feel a poem coming on, but I won't. But something very comforting about our food.
I think that, like, I think everyone summed it up, right? We have things about community and our food, which, I feel sorry for anyone who doesn't know what Korean food tastes like. They're like, it's kind of like only getting to the edge of the kingdom of God and then never going in. But the prayer piece, I have very similar experience in terms of my own grandmother. Like, I firmly believe that my life turned out somewhat normal because my grandmother prayed so much and just poured over on her knees to God for the sake of our family. And then, issues like hospitality, things like hospitality. And then, one of the things that my father-in-law always says is, from the Korean church, you can learn passion and fervor and sacrifice and generosity. And from the white church, you learn how to do structure and organization. and I think there's something to that, right? I mean, like, there's life in the Korean community, that there's vibrancy in the Korean community. We don't do it perfectly, but we stay together. And I think that's something that's beautiful about what, about the Korean American and the Korean, just the Korean culture, is that no matter how much we end up disagreeing at the end, like we can, I mean, and a lot of Koreans would know this, like there's a lot of fights that take place within Korean churches between elders and congregants and pastors because of unresolved issues that I think, that we're trying to address to some degree here. But for a lot of the time, they still stick it out, they still work together. And my hope is that we won't be like the Korean church and continue to split in those senses, but we'll continue to find ways to celebrate the beauty of our heritage and our culture, and continue to live into what God has kind of deposited into us, so that we're not hiding what we've been given under a rock.
Thank you for highlighting, just that notion of jung, that stickiness, just because you're Korean, we're Korean, and you're, I got you type of thing. Thank you. It's such a great way to end. I'm so indebted to our panelists for giving of your time, your expertise, and really just your wisdom. I think this experience has proven to be very therapeutic and cathartic for a lot of us, and the attendees have definitely stated that in the chat box. Thank you so much. I'm also very excited that we have a special guest with us today. He's a dear friend of Mustard Seed Generation. So Jae Jin, he's a Korean American singer, songwriter, and speaker, and he'll be performing his original title, Postlude. So Jae, welcome, and thank you. Take us away.
Thank you. As it says in John 13:34, we are to, just as we have been loved, we're to love one another. And I think it's a good reminder, especially after today's. So this is a song called Postlude. Grace be with you in all your days. And nights bring blessings in a quiet resting place. May your hearts be filled with kindness, reaching out for those in need. Though the smoke is ever rising, you slowly learn to breathe. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. Oh, darling, can't you see? I'm trying so hard, I'm trying to be what you see in me. May the peace be with you as you feel the coming war. May you hear the knock in silence, feeling death could be at the door. May you laugh as you once did in your favorite childhood memory. And may you feel every furtive glancing, every moment's revelry. Won't you feel? Yes, won't you feel? This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. Oh, darling, can't you see? I'm trying so hard, I'm trying to be what you see in me. be still, for love will be your shelter through the storm, through the storm. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. This world is changing me, but I still love you faithfully. Oh, Father, can't you see? I'm trying so hard, I'm trying to be what you see in me.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. Jae, I know that we're all clapping in our living rooms right now. Thank you so much for blessing us with that song. I love the chorus where it says, "This world is changing me, but I'll still love you faithfully." And our hope is always that, through these resources and through this webinar, that we would be able to better love ourselves and love our neighbors through this. And so we hope that you enjoyed our webinar. Please go follow him at Jae Jin Music. His website is also jaejinmusic.com, where he's going to post his future events. Hopefully physical presence will be a possibility so we can all hear him live like we did virtually. So thank you, Jae, for joining us. And also you could hear his story too. He has an incredible story as well. And so please find him on his website and his social media. Thank you, Jae.
Thank you.
I'm going to also just say a word of big thank you for joining us. Mustard Seed Generation, we desire to create these spaces. I saw in the chat box, we're asking for more conversation. I'm thirsting to hear more from our speakers as well, especially around this topic. And I think we could totally think about a part 2 to this conversation, as some people mentioned. I also just want to mention that our organization is purely volunteer run. It's really run by dedicated volunteers as well as dedicated sponsors who are financially committing to this work so that we can provide these resources for our Korean American community. If you are interested in supporting our mission and getting further involved, you can join us at mustardseedgeneration.org/get involved. And we would love to have you partner with us in this work. And lastly, I do want to share that to close out our month of webinars, we have one last webinar coming up next Friday to close off our May series. And this is specifically for high school students, especially because of COVID-19. Thinking about college has been a little cause of stress for a lot of families. So we were able to get together just really dedicated school counselors, recruitment directors, and college admissions officers who are giving time out of their day and their responsibilities to be able to serve our Korean American students. And so this is open to all high school students. We'll be breaking them off into interactive breakout rooms where they can converse with our speakers, and we'll be addressing questions around like how to choose the right college, especially during this time when it might be hard to tour, what social and emotional factors arise in college, as well as questions like how can I strengthen my application during COVID-19 when we're not as able to be as mobile as we used to. And so if you know anyone that could be a good candidate to join our webinar, it is free, and we really want to allow our community to learn from people who are very well versed in these topics. And so if that is of interest, please visit us at our website, as well as you could register using that bit.ly link there. But all that information, as well as our speaker bios, will be listed on our website. So we're very excited to have this final event to close out for us. So we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Bye. Thank you. In my experience, Koreans and Korean Americans who grew up in majority white context or had their faith developed in a white evangelical church, words like quote unquote privilege, racism, or anything about race white supremacy are all trigger words, which are usually met by canned responses and deflections. Is there a way y'all have found helpful to have a very 101 level discussion on these topics that would eventually lead to recognizing the trigger words in a healthier way?
Well, now it's time to plug our books. I have a couple things that I've written. One is called White Out, and it's the understanding dominance and supremacy, white supremacy. That could be helpful. A new book, it's just about to come out, May 2020, White Evolution. But it's the same concept. It's the idea that how do you not be triggered by these words? What's a deeper underlying assumptions behind some of these defense mechanisms? And the newest book, White Evolution, it's not just for white people. So whiteness and white supremacy is embedded in all of us. This is the now famous Cornel West statement. He's daily trying to kill the white supremacist that lives in him. This is an African-American scholar who says that. And if it's true of him, then it's true of me and it's true of others. So people of color struggle with white supremacy in our assimilationist ideals and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's one suggestion. You've got to read. I think you've got to read more. It's not going to happen in a comment on Facebook or Twitter. You're just not going to convince anybody on a one-off comment.
One of the consequences of growing up in a really predominantly white space is internalized racism, like we talked about. And one of the manifestations of that is distancing yourself from stereotypes. So distancing yourself from other Asian Americans or Koreans because you don't want to be associated with those negative stereotypes that are associated with them. And so I like to think of it as more of like, this is their way of surviving. That's how they've survived, having this particular way of thinking. And so to undo that, I think some key things are for them to experience Korean culture, Korean people in a healing and restoring way, to see that we're not defined by these stereotypes. And then to learn Korean American, Asian American history. I think that's also really helpful. But I think it's hard because it feels sometimes like they're kind of like betraying or like traitors, but it's the way that people survive. Yeah.
I think we need to understand that words like white supremacy are not 100 level words. If you are still in the very beginning stages of your racial and ethnic identity, that of course is not only a trigger word, you don't have an understanding of what that even means and the impact of white supremacy on your daily life. And so I would encourage really small baby steps, really important foundational steps. So, you know, Dr. Jun is promoting his book. So I will also self-promote, which is very, very awkward for a Korean American woman.
Do it.
So More Than Serving Tea was written more than a decade ago, and yet still resonates with people who read it. And so it is a pan-Asian, Asian American women writing about their faith from the perspective of examining their ethnic identity. And so I would highly recommend that. Not just for women, but for men too, in understanding kind of the fuller picture of the way we are raised within gender construct and how that plays out within the church context. And then I would say other baby steps, read. There's a great resource out there, and I cannot remember, it's the Unpacking the Backpack, right? Why can I not think?
Peggy McIntosh.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Yep.
That's it, right? And so it's not a perfect resource, but I think it's important to kind of start into that and unpacking kind of the understanding of whiteness and not as something that we are separate from as Asian Americans and Korean Americans. I think that is a helpful resource in understanding language around privilege and where some of us hold different privilege that others don't.
Yeah, I think you have to acknowledge that race is a factor in our experience, and if it's not, then you're kind of living in a bubble that of your own kind of doing that you've been conditioned to kind of live in, right? And so there are a host of books that just kind of talk about race, and you can kind of look into those. If you're in the white evangelical world, or if you're in the evangelical world is predominantly white, and so we'll call it the white evangelical world. We start with people like Michael Emerson, who wrote Divided by Faith, to help people understand what that experience is like, what the white evangelical toolkit is. William Julius Irving wrote a book on, oh my goodness, the title is leaving my mind. But then I think other things that are helpful to consider are things like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I mean, these are things that kind of tell the story of marginalized communities that move people into it. But I found that Korean Americans have more white fragility than a lot of white people do, right? And so reading White Fragility is actually helpful because it actually defines what the Korean American reaction is to talking about issues of race. But I think the fundamental question we have to ask is race a factor in our experiences and in our lives, yes or no? And if it is, then we have to address it. If it's not, then maybe we have to do a little more research, because I think there's an overwhelming account of all the ways that it does impact us. And then, of course, the Asian American Christian Collaborative is trying to produce resources to help people on their awareness journey to create, to help develop a consciousness around issues surrounding race. And then, I think a lot of people, Asian Americans, they end up really learning much when they delve into Asian American history. So Making of Asian America by Erica Lee, America for Americans, The Color of Success by Ellen Wu, Yellow by Frank Wu, Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki. You just kind of go down a list. And once you start seeing how people in past generations who had been combating racism experienced the society, you see yourself reflected in those stories, and you're like, wow, nothing has really changed. It just kind of has morphed and evolved.
I was just going to add that the reality is, even if they see themselves as being very white, the world does not see them that way. And so more than likely, they will have a jolting experience that will kind of, really kind of break their world and the way they understand it. And in my opinion, these conversations are so important because it's so much easier when those experiences are contextualized and there are people talking about it versus just all of a sudden having that experience alone and not really understanding how to make meaning or sense out of it. Great job.
What about saying we have different advantages over others and vice versa? Example being college educated, our unemployment levels and rate of home ownership differ greatly than those without a college degree gives us certain advantages over those without.
Oh dear, it's the model minority question. I think I would like to start off this response by saying that Korean Americans are not as successful as we perceive everyone to be, that there's such a disparity in levels of education, in the conditions upon which we immigrated or were forced out. And so I think it's very important to realize that Korean America is very diverse, and that we really can't say everyone's very successful or has a college degree. In fact, we also know students who drop out of college, oftentimes they are Korean Americans. There's a dissertation, I can cite it later, but they actually looked at Korean Americans in elite colleges and universities, and up to 50% were dropping out. And so we have to think about, again, the larger context.
Yeah, I think that the question actually is a reflection of the stereotypes and the myths that we have begun to believe and become a part of our story. And the reality is that even though many of our families were able to immigrate to the US because someone had a college degree in a field that the US was allowing, that actually was not the original intent of those immigration laws. And very rarely did our immigrant adults and parents land jobs in those fields. And for many of them, they would never return to those fields. It was really a select few who were able to kind of enter into that space. And then I think that that is part of the Korean and maybe the Korean immigrant church experience, is that you only hear about the kids who did well. And you only hear about the kids who go into those elite schools. You don't hear about the kids who never made it, who dropped out, who had mental health issues, who X, Y, and Z. And so I think we do have advantages. We do have advantages. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I think it's very important to be able to name the areas of privilege and advantage that we come from so that we can socially locate ourselves in the conversation. However, I don't think that we have to pretend that those advantages get erased, because they do, right? Josephine, you were saying, at the end of the day, every one of us at some point is met with the reality, we're not white. So we can play into whiteness and we can try to assimilate for survival's sake, but at some point, the reality is we're not white. I tell my white friends, I tell my Black friends all the time, I can assimilate. My name is Kathy, but you all know that that is actually not my name. Right? And then for all of us, our names are not Kathy Khang, right? Our names are Kang Kyung-ah, right? All of those things, but we have done what we can to assimilate. But at the end of the day, I can't undo this. Even if I did surgery and all of those things, at the end of the day, I can't hide this. And so those advantages are just part of the myth that upholds whiteness. And so we need to address that. And then we need to address how in our churches, we amplify and uphold those systems.
Is it just me, or can I listen to Kathy Khang talk all day? So good, so good.
My parents can't, my family does not want to listen to me.
Yeah, they're going to need you back eventually. I would just add, everything that you all said was spot on. I think that we would assume that certain privileges buy us out of being racialized. And I think people will try. Better communities, private schooling, you insulate yourselves into certain spaces, access to country clubs and whatnot, but it does not change the racialization. And I think we have to recognize that. That may be beyond the scope of the question, but I think that's part of it. And then the other part I think is the colorism, again, within Asian American communities, even within Korean communities. Colorism is something that we have to recognize in terms of privilege. And we ourselves recognize light skin privilege, positive stereotyping in terms of the way police, by and large, treat Asian American motorists fundamentally different. We have that privilege. The types of suffering for Asian Americans in America are definitely different.
I do think that like the question does assume that that there's like a ladder to success, right? There's a single ladder that we all have to climb, and each of those things, like getting a college degree, unemployment, like buying a home, those things like get you to a place. And what most people don't realize is that that definition of success is oftentimes shaped by a white racial imagination and defined by what a white dominant society actually speaks about. And you know, like one of the conversations the panelists were having even before through email was talking about Jae's story, you know, that he deviated from the kind of the path that a lot of Asian Americans or Korean Americans kind of have set before them, right? The reason that we all want to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers is because it was racialized into us, right? Not just, they knew that in order to succeed in America, you had to be one of those things, those three things, because there was a racialization of respectability in society. And at least that way, you won't get further marginalized, at least in the minds of those who are imposing that. So if you're not a doctor, you're not a lawyer, you're not a business, you know, X, Y, and Z, then you're clearly, you know, like a second-class citizen. And anyone who deviates from that kind of experiences all the shame, experiences all the struggle, and then our own creativity is never even like allowed to be explored. You know, the things that we are uniquely kind of instilled with, you know, the gifts, the passions that God might have kind of called us into are things that we kind of distance ourselves from. And so even that question, as Kathy was sharing, you know, suggests that there's one path to success, one definition of what the highest pinnacle, you know, reality is, and then everything else is kind of like, you didn't make it, but okay, like as if like you don't have a sufficient place in God's kingdom.
Yeah, and there are studies on the mental health effects of internalizing these beliefs. So one study I found, there are 3 consequences. So one is it puts pressure on Asian Americans that don't fit that mold. They feel like they have to embody those stereotypes but don't measure up. And so that puts an emotional toll. And then it can also add to, ironically, shame and embarrassment if you stand out. So I think we've all experienced oh, you're Asian, so you're good at math. So even if you are good at math, and that is something to be proud of, you didn't want to be good at math because you just want to fit in and be normal. And so this idea of Asian exceptionalism actually can add to shame and embarrassment. And then finally, it also leads to resistance to seeking help. If you believe that you are this model minority that has a college degree and can find a good job and find a house, then you don't need help. You don't need counseling. And so I think it can actually impact your mental health. Even though these seem to be good things, it can negatively impact your mental health.
Good, thank you all. I think that was like a great question to kind of wrap back around to mental health. So thank you, Jeannie, for sharing, and for everyone for sharing. Thank you so much.
All right, now for the picture.
Oh.
1, 2,